Welcome back to the Big Tire Garage. Now today's video is going to be a complete how-to getting a LS engine underneath the hood of your Jeep JK. We're going to cover every single step of the process, and we're going to use this vehicle right here. Now I know it looks like a two-door Jeep Gladiator, but it is not. It is actually a 2007 four-door Jeep JK that I cut in half and customized to look like a two-door Jeep Gladiator. So if you're planning a V8 swap in your JK from 2007 to 2012, this vehicle is going to answer every single question that you might have. But as always, here in the Big Tire Garage, we start with a cup of coffee. Now before you start any engine swap, the first step is going to be a little bit of research. You want to make sure that when it's all said and done, the vehicle is still legal to drive on the street. Now all the rules and regulations that pertain to this are going to be around basically emissions control devices and sometimes some safety items that need to be reinstalled or remain active in the vehicle that you're taking the engine out of. Now, honestly, this is going to change depending on what state you live in, what country you live in, and sometimes even what county you live in. So do your research before you plan your engine swap. Great resource for that is honestly SEMA. SEMA will have information either on their website or they can help you get to the correct documentation for your state or location to ensure that the swap that you're doing will be legal in the end. Now for myself, in my area, what I need to do is whatever is newer, whether it's the vehicle or the engine that's going in it, the emissions devices from one of those has to remain. So let's say I had a 1932 Ford. That obviously has no emissions devices. If I take an engine out of a mid-2000s Chevrolet, an LS, it doesn't mean I get to remove all the emissions devices because it's going into a 32 Ford. The engine is newer. So all the emissions components that are with that 2007 engine have to remain active when it goes into that 1932 Ford. To make my life simple on this swap, I just did the easiest thing possible. That's a 2007 Jeep four-door JK Wrangler, although it looks like a Jeep Gladiator. That is not what it is. It's a four-door Jeep that I cut in half and turned into a two-door Gladiator, and it's a 2007. I just went out and found a 2007 Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck, found a super good deal on it online. It had a bad transmission, but the engine was running and driving, so I was able to hear it. I just bought the whole truck. Sometimes it's cheaper to actually buy a whole vehicle than it is to just buy an engine. I think I paid like 800 bucks for the whole truck, and now I have everything that I need on that truck, and I can pull it off and put it on the engine that's going in this vehicle. So now that that's out of the way, what is the first step in actually working on the vehicle? Well, the first step is going to be locating the engine in the engine bay, and you need to plan for things like suspension movement, transmission placement, and on a four-wheel drive, obviously, we have to worry about transfer case location. So we'll get the body up and out of the way, we'll start working. Just a quick reminder before we jump into this video, we have a few of our Bad Old Wagon limited edition Big Tire Garage t-shirts still available, and there are limited sizes and they're running out, and when this thing is sold out, we are not reprinting it ever. Let me know in the comments what project t-shirt you want us to put out next in this limited edition run, and also don't forget you can get your stickers and your iron-on patches at the link in the description below. All right, let's get to V8 swapping a JK. Now this body has already been off of the Jeep, so it was basically just mocked up underneath here, but this is basically what you need to do to take a JK body off. You're going to disconnect the steering. You can either unbolt the master cylinder, lay it to the side, or what I like to do is I just undo all the brake lines. I'm going to be putting new calipers on this anyway, so it's going to have to be bled. Disconnect the wiring from the computer. There's two lever lock connectors up there at the body. There's one lever lock connector down here. at the bottom of the radiator. It's right there, actually. I'd take the power steering reservoir, take it off the core support, and lay it with the motor. You have to pull the wiring off of the FICM, which is up in there. I pull the radiator, AC condenser, and grill out just for safety. And then you'll also obviously have to discharge the AC, get it disconnected, disconnect your heater core lines, which are up there. And that's basically, oh, automatic transmission cooler lines from the transmission up to the radiator as well. I just cut those because we're doing an engine swap. It's going to be all new cooler lines. Underneath, it's a couple transfer case shifter, transmission shifter, and then the e-brake cables. And if it was still a JKU, you'd have to disconnect the fuel filler at the back. And that's basically it. It's really not that hard to get a JK body off of a frame. You can usually get them done with a 2-post lift, probably in maybe hour and a half, 2 hours at the most, and get it up out of the way. Don't forget, make sure that you secure your steering wheel, because you don't want to break the clock spring in that thing while you're working on it. So what I'm going to do right now is basically lift this truck cab or Jeep cab, what do you want to call it, up, and then I'll rip the 6-cylinder out, and then we can start looking at our V8 that's going in its place. For this swap, yes, I said I've got everything out of a 2007 Silverado, and that is because actually I bought one of the classic Cat Eye 07 Silverados really, really cheap because it had a bad transmission in it, and I basically just stuck it out back. And that's what I'm going to be robbing parts off for this engine. But this is a completely rebuilt long block from engines.com. Now, the reason I went with this is because the Silverado I got was fairly high mileage, and I kind of figured, you know what, if I pull the motor, send it to my engine guy, have him go through it, it usually ends up costing me around $2 grand to have it rebuilt. And this engine was $2,600 was retail on this engine when I bought it. They're having like a end of year sale when I picked it up. I think it's regularly like $2,800. So to get this rebuilt long block with a warranty, it's just nice. I don't have to send anything out to the machine shop, but I can still take all the parts off the other engine and put it onto this. Now, the first step that I'm going to do is basically mock this whole package up. Now, I didn't go through the process of getting the old engine out because actually we did that on my show Four Wheeler, so you're not even going to be able to see it. We already shot that for TV. But basically, you know, engine, transmission come out, cut old mounts off, grind frame smooth. We've got these universal mounts from Advanced Adapters, and the one thing you have to pay attention to is just disconnect the fuel back here. There's basically a feed line and a purge line. There's two different lines there. We'll go through those when we get to that point. But I want to mock it all up in here right now because I want to put the engine, my 4L80 transmission, and my transfer case in because I want to figure out if those mounts are in the right spot to keep the front drive shaft, basically that stock drive shaft, in place. That's what I really want to do. I don't have a problem getting a custom rear shaft because I already changed the rear axle on this thing, so I know I'm going to need it. But I'd like to be able to just reuse that stock shaft, and I think if I just play around a little bit, I can make it fit. So I'm going to bolt a few things onto this engine first. That's where I'm going to start. Just a couple items that I want to put on. We'll talk through that. Then I'll put the transmission onto the engine, no torque converter, just basically mocking it all up. Then we'll put the transfer case on. Actually, we'll just do engine, transmission in, and then I'll show you what I have to do to the transfer case to make it fit. talk a little bit about popular choices in V8 swaps for the Jeep Wrangler. So really, when you boil it down, there's two popular options. There's going to be a Hemi, and the Hemi, there's many different versions of that, from a 350 horsepower truck motor all the way up to a 1,000 horsepower Hellcat swapped engine. And then you have the other popular one, which is the General Motors. We call them LSs, but they're not LSs. That's just what the general term is. So it's Gen 3, Gen 4, basically that modern General Motors small block. And the same thing holds true there. You have cubic inch sizes from 4.8 all the way up to basically 7 liters. You can get anything from 350 horsepower up to 1,000. I chose to do the LS in this Jeep because of the fact that I honestly believe that dollar per horsepower, the LS-based or the General Motors-based engine will always win. The Hemi engine is a great engine, but they are expensive to get from the factory. I mean, just a junkyard engine usually costs about $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 just to get those truck engines if you want a good one. Start getting into some of the more exotic stuff, they're $20,000, $30,000. Whereas I can get an LS engine. Basically, I bought a vehicle for $1,000 and I got a complete running 5.3 liter, and then I was able to get a long block to basically make it a brand new engine for $2,500 bucks. So I'm starting with essentially a crate engine for, we'll call it maybe $3,000. That to me is a great benefit to the LS engine. The other nice thing about the LS is it's incredibly popular outside of the off-road space, so in the hot rod space. So there's a lot of stuff. There's cool intakes, cool valve covers, accessory drives, all that kind of stuff. Plus the LS engine being a staple in off-road racing, there's different brackets for accessories and all that kind of stuff. So the LS engine, I feel personally, is just a better option if you're trying to get the most bang for the buck. The Hemi, it is honestly a great engine. I have one in my M715 and I love it. But as I said, it's an expensive engine to procure. And more importantly, after that, it's also an expensive engine every time you have to go shopping for parts. You got to remember, you want to just change spark plugs in your LS versus spark plugs in your Hemi. Well, guess what? There's twice as many spark plugs in that Hemi. There's twice as many coils on that. It's not cheap. It adds up fast when you own a Hemi. Beautiful engines, absolutely love them, but they're not cheap. So that is why I chose to put an LS underneath the hood of this Jeep. But it's not just any LS, I'm actually doing some cool stuff with it as well. All right, so the first step in any engine swap is going to be locating the engine in the chassis. Now, in the case of an LS in a JK, there's a few things that you have to watch out for. Number one, you don't want the engine sitting up too high. That's why I installed that low profile oil pan. You can see now that that oil pan is actually up nice and high. So I can build a skid plate off of this cross member back here to protect that oil pan. The truck oil pan sits almost 4 or 5 inches lower. So using that low profile oil pan, that's the first thing that you want to do. Second thing you need to make sure of is clearance in the front. So it's going to be a balancer. It's going to go on here. Then obviously alternator up here, power steering pump down there, AC pump sits over here. I'm going to want to mock all that stuff up just to make sure I have clearance. You want to make sure you have clearance for the steering gear. The JK steering gear sits a little bit proud of the inside of the frame. You also want to make sure you have room for your front drive line to come down through. And then you also want to make sure, this is one thing that I am concerned about with this particular one, is if you look right in here, you can see that these motor mounts, so this is a universal motor mount kit from Advanced Adapters. I use these all the time. So you can see that that motor mount sitting right there, I'm worried that this upper control arm might hit it when the suspension comes up to full compression. So what I think I'm probably going to do is jack up the entire vehicle, I'll unbolt the shocks, I'll pull the springs out, and then I'll let the suspension fully compress. That's a really good way to make sure that you have clearance for everything. You really want to make sure you have clearance when that axle is all the way up, because that's where it's going to contact things. So once I know that I have space there, then we can start looking at the transfer case. So the transfer case goes in behind this 4L80E that I've got bolted up behind my engine. And it'll basically bolt on here. And I'm really wanting to try and save that front drive shaft and just basically use that front drive shaft in stock form. I think that'd be really, really nice to be able to just reuse that and not have to get a custom shaft for the front. Now, when it comes to the 4L80, you have a couple of choices with the transfer case. and I'll show you those when we get there. What I'm going to do right now is basically mock up everything on the front of the motor. So that means alternator, power steering pump. I might put the AC pump on, I'm not 100% sure. And then I think I will do exactly what I'm saying. I think I'm going to jack up the front of the Jeep. I'll probably just grab the bumper with the engine crane, disconnect the front shocks, pull the springs out, let the entire truck sit down on its bump stops, and then I'll make sure I have clearance for everything on that engine. If I do, then we can move on to checking the transfer case. To get the engine placement where I want it, I need to trim these universal engine mounts in order to move the entire drivetrain just a little bit closer to the passenger side of the vehicle. All right, body's dropped back down. I did have a clearance issue with the suspension, so I know the motor's got to come up, and that's why I dropped the body on it. I think the plan right now will be to bring the entire drivetrain up about 2 inches. What you need to watch out for here when you're doing this is you want to make sure that you still have plenty of room at the back where the transmission goes through the transmission tunnel, and it looks like I have plenty of room right there. And you also obviously want to make sure that you have plenty of room for the motor to go straight up, which I do. So at this point, I think the plan will be to pull the body back off, cut the mounts loose, and then we can move the drivetrain up, tack them back in, and then we'll drop the body back down, test fit it again. I am having a slight issue with my super cool valve covers. I got these finned valve covers because I thought they just looked really cool, and they cover up the coils so you don't have to look at them. Unfortunately, it's hitting my battery box over here, so I think while it's apart, or while the body's up in the air, I may trim that battery box there, just that edge of that, just to clearance them, because I think it's going to be, I still want to run those valve covers. I just think they look cool, you know, I just think it looks kind of a different look. I'm also running this intake. I have this intake on my bomber. I know it's probably, honestly, probably doesn't even flow as good as the truck intake, but I don't care. I think the truck intake is ugly as all get out, so I think if I put that intake in there, it's perfect. I can't really put the motor back any further because of the head location. It gets back into the firewall on both sides, and I don't really need it to go back, I don't think. I think I still have plenty of room. I might test fit the radiator right now just to double check, but I think I am in good shape right here. So we'll test fit the radiator, and then we'll take a look at it again, and then take it all back apart. With the engine up 2 inches, I think this is the perfect spot for it. Now, when you're doing this, you do need to check a couple of things. You want to make sure that there is enough room for the steering shaft to get by your valve cover and your exhaust, which in this case, it looks like we're not going to have any problem. Probably what I'll do is test fit the exhaust manifold just to make sure. The AC lines, these are all going to have to be custom, so there's no real issues here. I have lots of clearance at the hood, and then especially with the LS's, you want to make sure that you have room to get an intake elbow in here. Now it's going to be tight, but I should be able to get an intake elbow in here and around down through here. My upper radiator hose will be coming down through here and then coming basically over the intake and then down into the water pump. And then I am going to have to slightly trim this battery box if I want to use my coil covers on these valve covers, because these valve covers are obviously a lot higher than stock valve covers, but I really do like how they look. I think it kind of dresses up the engine bay. The plan here will be to basically black out everything on this engine. I just think it looks really good. The black alternator, black intake, black valve covers, everything. I'm just going to basically make everything black in this engine bay, and I think it will look really good. Probably what I'll do is test fit an intake elbow here just to make sure that it's going to be good. I may have to trim some of the support off this fan shroud. This is actually not the fan shroud I'm going to use, so maybe better to put the actual fan in place first that I want to use, and then we'll check for clearance on that. But as it is right now, I'm liking where that engine is sitting. Like I said, we'll test fit the exhaust manifold, check the steering, and then we'll go from there. I'm planning to continue to run a Jeep transfer case in this project. Now, really, you have 2 options in the JK. One is a Rocktrack 241, that's a 4-to-1 case, and then just the regular JK case, which has a 272-to-1 low range ratio. Now, if you want to run the Rocktrack, you are going to have to disassemble the transmission and install a new output shaft. But since I plan to run the factory 272-to-1, just basically regular sport case, I have to change out the input shaft on the transfer case instead. This is actually a lot easier, and I think that the torque from the V8 engine is actually going to work really well with the 272-to-1 low range ratio. At this point, I'm very happy with the location of the entire drivetrain. The motor mounts are in a good spot. There's clearance for the power steering pump around the steering gear. Transmission, lots of room for it on the floor, lots of room for the firewall on the engine, and the transfer case fits in perfect. I was kind of hoping to reuse that front drive shaft, but I cannot. It's just going to be basically make 1.5 inches too short, so I'm going to have to get a custom front drive shaft. I did have to make some modifications to the transfer case. There's these little nubs off the back of this case right here, and they're actually contacting this cross member. I'll actually cut off this last one as well just to give myself some additional clearance. So once I get that taken off of there, I'm going to basically mock everything up, get it put into place, and then I can start working on our transmission mount. With the drivetrain mocked up into place and the body back on, I need to ensure that there's room between the transfer case and the floor. The drivetrain is now in a new position, so before I commit to an actual transfer case mount, I just want to make sure that there's room for everything underneath, and right now it looks perfect. The transmission mount is all done. I just basically cut this out on my plasma table, welded it up, ground it smooth, then weld it onto the cross member. This is just a part store transmission mount, super simple. It's a rubber mount. It's actually the mount for the 4L80. That's what fits the advanced adapters bracket. One thing you do need to pay attention to with mounts of a drivetrain is you want to make sure that the transmission mount and the motor mounts are made of the same material. So if you had solid mounted your engine, like I do in a tube buggy or in a race car, you want to make sure that you solid mount the transmission. If you've used poly, the small little round poly mounts, you want to make sure that you use a good stiff poly mount on the transmission mount as well, because as the engine torques, if you have those mounts made out of differing materials, you can actually crack the bell housing on the transmissions. I've seen it done many, many times. So now the transmission's done. Essentially, the drivetrain is now located. What I'll do now is drop the body down. We'll rip the engine out, put it on a stand to finish assembling it. We can go ahead and weld in the mounts on the frame of the Jeep, and then that'll be done. And then we can essentially install the motor for good at that point. Once, as I said, once we get all the stuff bolted onto the motor when it's on the stand, I'm also going to give it a good coat of paint. We'll talk about the motor one more time before it goes back in. But that's it. Well, I don't know if it's step 1, 2, 3, or 4. I don't know. Step something. Locating the drivetrain in the Jeep is incredibly important. And now that I've done that, I got space around every part of the Jeep. I got space around the floor, space on the firewall, space for the suspension to move. All that's done. I can still use a skid plate under my transfer case, and I'll build a custom skid plate for the engine as well. Engine sitting up high, but not too high. It's that fine line you're going to dance. You're just going to basically move back and forth, put the engine up, put the engine down, and find the perfect spot for it, which is what we have right now. So now there's a little bit of welding, and the engine can be in there for good. In order for this water pump inlet to clear my throttle body, I need to apply a little bit of heat to it and bend it out of the way. You don't want to trim this shorter because it does have that little lip on the end to retain the hose. So a little bit of heat from the torch and we can bend it down and out of the way. I'm ready now to install the transmission and transfer case for good into the chassis, but I need to do one thing before I do that. The extension housing from Advanced Adapters to adapt the 4L80 to the Jeep 241, well, it has the transmission mount in it. And I don't want to bolt this up into place without first setting the depth and the location of this little speed sensor tone ring on the input shaft of the transfer case. Now, the reason that you need that speed sensor on the input shaft of the transfer case is because the 4L80 measures input speed and output shaft speed to determine if there's any slippage inside the transmission. But a lot of the four-wheel drive 4L80s did not have the tone ring installed into the transmission from the factory on the second speed sensor. So don't just assume that you have a tone ring inside that transmission. As a matter of fact, it's better to assume that it's not there and just make sure that you install this tone ring from Advanced Adapters when you get the extension housing to adapt the 4L80 to the 241. That way you will make sure that you have the correct speed signal feeding in to the computer. If the computer sees no output speed on that output speed shaft sensor, what it's probably going to do is kick your transmission into second gear only, limp home mode, and you'll be fighting that, trying to figure out, why is my transmission not shifting? Did I get a garbage transmission? What is going on? When all the time it's just a simple speed sensor reading. So get this kit from Advanced Adapters. It will just make the job a lot easier. And all you have to do is make sure that the tone ring itself is the correct depth. Inside on this little input shaft has these little set screws that will set it, and you basically will screw the speed sensor that comes with the kit into the extension housing to make sure it's in the right spot. Flexi McFlex plate. Originally, I was planning to run these factory LS6 exhaust manifolds, but once bolted up, they dump right onto the upper control arm, so I'm swapping them out for a set of aftermarket cast iron LS manifolds. At this point, the engine is in place, transmission, transfer case, essentially all your hard parts. Now it's time to start dealing with electrical and plumbing. Now I'm going to start with the fuel system. Now there's kind of two parts to the fuel system. We're going to do the fuel delivery system. We're going to be reusing the stock fuel pump that's in the factory tank. And then when you disconnected the fuel lines and removed your engine, there were two lines at the front of the tank. Now that is not a feed and a return. It's a feed that goes up to the engine, and then the female connector that you disconnected, that's actually part of the evap system. And we're going to reuse the evap system from the JK. We're just going to use some parts from the LS as well as some parts from the JK to make it all work. Now the first thing you need to do is basically locate your evap solenoid. Now the evap solenoid on the LS is either on the top of the intake, or on some of the cars it's basically right beside the fuel rail. And what you need to do is simply connect a rubber hose, make sure it's fuel hose, from that solenoid down to the female connector. I just went ahead and cut it off and basically slid the hose over the nylon line. Now I also used a evap solenoid that is from the car, not from the truck. That basically has barred fittings on either end. It's attached into the bottom of this new intake that I installed. Now for the fuel delivery, you need to make sure that your LS is a single fuel line fuel rail. Some of the LSs had a feed and a return. If you do have a feed and return LS, you need to basically convert it over to a feed only. That just basically means upgrading it to a newer set of fuel rails. I'm once again using aftermarket fuel rails and an aftermarket intake, so it can be whatever setup I want. And in this case, I'm just using a single feed into the end. And then I just went down to my local parts store, had them make up one of these nylon lines with two quick connect fittings. That way I can reuse the factory connection back here at the tank. I'll just plug that in. And then on the other end, I'll just run it up and connect it into the fuel rail. And then I have to secure it underneath the body of the truck. Just make sure that you keep it away from things like exhaust, front drive shafts, stuff like that. You just want to make sure this stays nice and safe. And sometimes it's a good idea to wrap it in some heat protective coating because it is going to basically be sitting right on top of this transmission. But that is just the first step in the fuel system. There's more work to do to make the evap system functional with the LS inside the JK. In order for the evap system to work, you're gonna need an actual evap valve out of the Silverado and then a fuel tank pressure sensor and a little T. We're basically gonna be modifying this T to fit into the purge line on the tank of the JK. I'm just using a permaclamp and a little piece of nylon fuel line. Then we're just gonna trim the factory purge line, open it up a little bit with a heat gun, and then we can install our new Silverado fuel pressure sensor in its place. In order for the canister purge system to work, we're going to use the factory purge valve off the JK. We're going to remove it, and inside you'll see there's a little valve that moves back and forth. I'm going to use some 5-minute epoxy to essentially glue this valve into the open position. And now this valve essentially just becomes a pass-through point for the Silverado valve to access the charcoal canister that's underneath the bed of my Gladiator or underneath the floor of your Jeep JK. This is how you adapt the system from the LS engine to work with the JK's parts that are already in the truck. Finished up all the plumbing I need to do with the body off. So the steam port for the LS, I just tapped it back into the water pump. If I was using an aftermarket radiator, I could run that into the radiator, but I do not. I'm gonna run the stock radiator, and the LS radiator does not have provisions for it. I was able to find an off-the-shelf power steering hose, high pressure hose that'll work, and then the return line. This is actually the JK return line fitting, and then just a piece of rubber hose in its place. Transmission lines, I ran all new hard lines front to back, so I just bent those up out of some 5/16 steel line. I like to use the steel lines whenever I can, even though down here at the transmission I have these little AN fittings. So what's going to happen, I'll have an AN barb that comes off of here, and then a little piece of rubber hose will go from here to there, and the same up here, a little piece of rubber hose go from here to here. I basically just tie those all together. Fuel lines are in place. They'll basically lay up in here. I'll probably end up attaching them to the body when I put the body back on. That way they're up off of the transmission. And the canister vent is all done. My new fuel tank pressure sensor is here, and the vent modification is complete. Two things I want to do before I put the body on. Number one, I'm going to start laying out the engine harness across the engine, get it all plugged in. It's just easier to do it before the body goes on. And I need to come up with a mount for my transmission shifter, or sorry, my transfer case shifter. So I'm using this cable that came with my adapter kit from Advanced Adapters. It basically allows me to use this cable instead of the stock cable, because obviously none of the stock stuff is going to work. But I do need to come up with some sort of a bracket that will basically hold this in place and allow me to shift that transfer case from inside the cab. I don't know if I'm going to build it off of these little studs right here and out, or maybe off of these little studs on the transmission. I think I'm just going to lay it out, figure it out, and we'll go from there. Before the body goes on, the last thing I'm going to deal with is the wiring and the computers needed to make the engine run as well as make the Jeep happy. Now, depending on what you're going to do with your Jeep JK in the long run, there's lots of different options. So if your plan is to just basically build, off-road vehicle, and you don't care about things like the ignition key working or the gauges or your AC request being able to turn your air conditioning on and off, then you can just use a standalone harness. So you can get a chopped down factory ECU and a modified factory harness, hook up a couple of wires with some switches inside and a push button start. Or you could use an aftermarket system from a company like Holley. They have a bunch of different options from simply making the engine run to making the engine run and then adding things later like turbo timers and nitrous and all kinds of stuff. The Dominator ECU from Holley can do so much stuff, it's not even funny. But if you're like me and the end goal is to make this Jeep JK act like it came with an LS engine underneath the hood from the factory, well, I've done a lot of research, and in my opinion, the best option is a harness kit from RPM Extreme. Now, you do have to do some things ahead of time. So the first thing you got to do is your factory ECU that the engine came with, that's going to have to be modified slightly, and RPM Extreme can help you out with that. There's a way to basically pull the tune out of that computer, send it to them, they'll modify it so it'll work. The Jeep computer, you don't have to do anything with it, but you will need to do some additional wiring with their harness to have the Jeep computer talk to the GM computer or the LS engine computer, and then all of that function together inside the cockpit so things like your ignition key and your AC request work. Now, the reason that I think this is the best way to do this is because my plan, as I said, was to make this Jeep seem like it came with an LS from the factory. And a lot of that revolves around a system that's in a lot of modern vehicles, and that is called CAN bus communication. So the Jeep JK uses CAN bus for pretty much everything that happens inside the passenger compartment when you're driving the Jeep. See, in the old days, when you got in, put your key in the ignition column, and you basically turned it to on, you're basically connecting two 12-volt wires that talk to a couple relays that would just turn things on underneath the dash, maybe make the fuel pump run in the back, get the computer ready to go, and then when you turned it to crank, you were literally taking a 12-volt signal up into the steering column, turning the contacts with the key, and then that 12 volts would go down and spin the starter. A vehicle like a JK does not do that, and most modern vehicles don't. What happens in the JK is when you get in, you put the key on, you turn it to on, you're basically doing what's called waking up a module in the CAN bus system. And that module is going to take a bunch of information from other modules in the Jeep as well as from the ECU from the Jeep to determine, are we ready to start the engine? And then when you turn it to start, it's not a 12-volt signal going up the steering column and then down to the starter. What you're doing is, by turning it to start, you're talking to the module. The module has checked everything and says, yeah, it's okay to energize the starter, start the car. So that module tells the ECU. The ECU then sends a signal down to start the actual starter. It's incredibly complicated. Can you work around it yourself? Absolutely. You could actually use some aftermarket ECUs to recreate some of the CAN bus signals underneath the dash to basically mimic all of this stuff, and you could make it all work if you wanted to spend the time. But the RPM Extreme harness, they've done all the work for you. They have figured out a way and supply you with a CAN bus communication link and a system that basically allows the Jeep ECU and the LS ECU to work together to make your Jeep act like it basically came with that LS engine underneath the hood from the factory, which is what I want. I want everything to work. I want the gauges to work. I want the key to work. I want AC request to work. I want the vehicle to just be like it was, just with a V8 underneath the hood. So that's what I'm going to do, and that is the harness that I'm going to be using. The cool thing is that harness is set up, like I said before, with all the emission stuff in place. I have upstream O2s, downstream O2s. I've got my canister vent already taken care of. Everything that my '07 Silverado had for emissions, this Jeep JK will also have in place, which is key to making this vehicle legal to drive on the street. So my next job is to lay the harness out, hook it all up, and then the body can go back on.
You do have to add an additional temperature sensor to the LS engine to work with the JK computer in order for your gauges to work on the dash.
One of the unique things about the RPM Extreme harness is it retains the Jeep's factory computer, and that is because of the CAN bus situation that I talked about earlier. So what you have is a plug that's going to come with your RPM Extreme harness, and it's going to plug into this section of your factory computer right here. And then you also have some splicing that you have to do. You have to access this connector on the computer to splice in 6 wires. And what you're going to be splicing into for that is, this is how we're going to basically have the CAN bus interact and control things. So we have cruise control, so that's two wires for the cruise control, 1 wire for the brake switch, that's also going to be for cruise control, as well as probably torque converter lockup. We're going to have an AC control wire, starter control, and then a fuel pump relay control. All of this is so you can end up with the dash of the JK and everything inside the Jeep retaining its factory functionality. So what that means is, as I talked about before with the CAN bus situation, you want the gauges to work, you want your AC requests to work, you want the key to work in the ignition. And the only way to do that, from all the research that I've done, is to use this RPM Extreme harness and tap into that factory computer. So in essence, we're going to end up with 2 different computers inside this vehicle. We're going to kind of have a body control computer, and that's going to be your factory Jeep computer that remains in place. Then we're going to have an engine control computer. It's actually going to be an ECU, or actually be more like a PCM, powertrain control module, because it's going to control the engine and the transmission together while getting signals from the body computer to tell the engine what to do. A long time ago, well, actually not that long ago, this is how vehicles were built. We had a different computer for a lot of different systems. You had an engine computer, a body computer, transmission computer, and it's only recently that OEMs have really bridged into this like whole vehicle computer system where everything is integrated into one system. So this is not that strange. Super cool though that I'm going to be able to have this LS underneath the hood, a 4L80 behind it, and still get in the Jeep and use it like it is a factory installed item. That's the best part about this entire swap. It's actually not that difficult, and once you get the back of the connector off, you'll see there's a number 1 at the top left, and then the last number in the connector is the bottom right, 38. And this is pretty standard for most automotive harnesses. It's going to go, basically there's going to be a row that's going to go 1 to whatever. In this case it's 1 to 10, and then 11 to 19, and you're just going to count from the top left to the bottom right, and then you look in the book and you're going to find the ones that match. The nice thing is the harness is actually color coded, so it's the exact same color as the wires that you're splicing into. That just makes life a lot simpler. You're not having to worry about matching up like a blue with a white. This is a blue with a green tracer. The wire that comes out of my harness is blue with a green tracer, so it makes life a lot simpler. And this is a really clean setup right here. So what I'll do now is I'll put the loom back on. I'm going to I'll tape this all up, put the loom back on, reinstall the connector, and then I can plug these in. The next bit of wiring is the harness that's going to go inside the cab of the JK. Now this basically connects to the engine harness on one end, and then all of this will then be inside the vehicle, and it connects to the CAN bus box, gives you an OBD2 port and all that kind of stuff. RPM Extreme suggests punching through the factory hole for the clutch on a manual transmission Jeep, so I'm going to take a look at that and figure that out. Then we'll hook up the large lever lock connector right here to the factory connector up there, and then these connectors will connect to the harness that I install. On the opposite side of the truck, you'll have where the battery is from the factory. You're going to reuse your battery cables. I've already hooked it up to the starter as well as a ground, so we're going to reuse those. And then these are the connectors for the computer that came with my engine, and that computer is basically going to mount right here behind the fuse box. And then we have this TAC module connection right here, and with it comes another harness that basically has to get fed inside the vehicle as well, and that's what hooks up to the throttle pedal that comes out of your donor truck. We no longer use the Jeep JK throttle pedal, we use the throttle pedal out of the truck that your engine came out of. And once that's done, I'll have one more piece of wiring to do, and we'll talk about that because it's actually part of the cooling system. But what I'll do right now is get all these wires ran inside the cab of the truck, get everything hooked back up, and then essentially the engine wiring is done. The underdash wiring is actually pretty simple. I just have some relays to mount. I have a small fuse block to mount underneath the dash as well. And then I have the two easy CAN bus modules that need to be mounted. All the connections are here, and then the secondary CAN bus module it's going to connect. And all that just has to get secured somewhere up underneath the dash, out of the way of the pedals and everything. And then I have the wire that came over from the TAC module. So this is the TAC module that controls basically the throttle along with the foot pedal or the accelerator pedal. So I have to plug this into the accelerator pedal, and to do that I have to remove the Jeep's accelerator pedal and install the accelerator pedal out of the truck. The next thing I need to deal with underneath the dash is the difference in the throttle pedals. So this is the throttle pedal that came out of my donor pickup truck, and this is the throttle pedal that was in the Jeep JK. You can see they're definitely at different angles, and they also bolt up differently. So what I did was I went ahead and marked on my fab table the location of the bolt holes, and then I know now that if I set this GM pedal in place, if I drill a bolt hole here, it'll bolt up to where the factory JK pedal was mounted in the Jeep. But then this angle is going to be all wrong right here. So you got a couple of choices. We could go ahead and build a bracket that would basically hold this pedal at a completely different angle, like this underneath the Jeep, and then maybe that would line up better. But the problem is, if you look right here, if you look down the pedals, so this pedal is basically just to the passenger side of the bolt hole, the mounting bolt hole, and this one's way over. So in essence, what I need to do is I need to move this part of the throttle pedal pretty much down to about here. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm simply going to cut this throttle pedal right here, and then I will figure out where this is going to sit. I still want possibly this little pivoty bit on there because I think that's kind of cool. So I think I'll leave that pivoty bit on there, but I'm going to cut this throttle pedal here. I might have to straighten out this bracket a little bit, but in essence, I'm going to make this sit right down here, just like that one does.
You could do this with a hand plasma if you wanted, but having the plasma table makes it a lot easier. And then all I'm gonna do is weld it onto the factory pedal and basically turn a really curvy pedal into kind of a straight pedal. Not easy filming underneath the dash, but my new throttle pedal is in and it is going to work just fine. Everything else has been mounted up, get a light in there for you, up underneath the dash as best it can. Basically got it secured, a couple different spots. And then I've got the relays and the fuse block behind this panel right here. So it's behind that panel in the dash. So everything is done underneath the floorboards of the truck, and that, I think, concludes almost all of the wiring.
I've already mentioned that I'm using a 4L80E transmission in this project. Now, because of that, my harness came with this connector. This connector plugs into a factory General Motors range switch that has to be bolted onto the side of the transmission. This range switch does two things: tells the General Motors computer what gear you have selected, and therefore allows the shift solenoids to control the transmission correctly, but it also will integrate with the Jeep dash to allow the gear selector indicator on the Jeep's dash still work. The problem is that there's two different versions of this shift shaft in the 4L80. There's a short and a long. The short is designed to work when you don't have an external range switch, and the long is with the external range switch. I need the range switch for this particular application, so that means I'm gonna have to take this pan off and replace this shift shaft. That's just something that you're gonna have to pay attention to. If you've chosen to do the 4L80 in your JK swap, make sure that you get a 4L80 with the correct length shift shaft. It's a hard thing to say, shift shaft. Make sure you have the correct length shift shaft installed from the rebuilder or when you buy the transmission, because you need to be able to have this range switch to work with your two computers. So that means it's just a little bit of work. Luckily, I was able to buy a shaft online. It won't be that much work. I take transmissions apart all the time.
I really want to retain the Jeep's factory shift lever inside of the truck and just modify it to fit onto this 4L80. So with a little bit of time in Bendtech Pro, I'm basically going to redraw the factory bracket that attaches this cable onto the Jeep transmission. Now this took a little bit of time, but you can see if you look, it matches up perfectly with that factory bracket. And now all I have to do is weld it up, paint it, bolt it up, and we'll see how it works.
Next step in our engine swap is going to be the exhaust. Now you have a lot of options when it comes to your exhaust, and no matter which way you shake it, you're going to be building or having built for you a 100% custom exhaust, because there is no one that sells an exhaust kit for an engine swap, pretty much no matter how popular the Jeep or the engine. And that is because there's a lot of different things that come into play. Placement of the engine, the type of engine, and most importantly, what suspension you have on your vehicle. If I had a long travel suspension kit on this truck, it completely changes how I route the exhaust versus just the factory control arm replacement lift that's on this Jeep right now. The first decision you do have to make, though, comes right at the engine, and that is a decision as to whether you're going to run exhaust manifolds or some type of tubular header. Now, cast exhaust manifolds used to get a pretty bad rap, but nowadays it's not deserved. You have to remember, if we look in the car world, let's look at a Hellcat wide-body red-eye Challenger. That thing's knocking on the door of 1,000 horsepower, and guess what's bolted up to the cylinder heads on that vehicle? That's right, cast exhaust manifolds. not headers. Yes, if we were chasing every single drop of horsepower out of an engine, we'd probably go to some type of long tube header, and we'd be playing around with things that involve with scavenging the exhaust gases out of the engine that can actually help improve the airflow into the engine. But that's not what we're doing. We're just building an everyday, daily driver, weekend wheeling Jeep with a V8 that's now underneath the hood. So all I want to do is get all the loud noises that happen inside the engine out of the back of the truck and through a muffler. So I'm starting with a set of cast LS exhaust manifolds, and it's all going to flow into a 2.5-inch full stainless exhaust system that I'm going to have to build. I do have to add a few things to the exhaust system. The first is going to be provisions for 4 different oxygen sensors, and those are going to work with my 2 high-flow catalytic converters. Now, when I sourced my catalytic converters, I made sure to spec catalytic converters that were factory replacement high-flow cats for a 2007 Chevrolet Silverado, because that's what my engine came out of. The O2 sensors are going to mount one in front of the catalytic converter, and that's referred to as the upstream O2, and then one behind the catalytic converter, that's considered the downstream O2. And they are just simply measuring the amount of oxygen inside the exhaust, and then the engine's computer is using that to basically adjust the fuel and timing inside the engine, make it run at its best. But the first step for me is simply to start cutting up some 2.5-inch stainless pipe, piecing it all together underneath the truck, and then I'll take it out of the truck to weld it here on the bench. As I said before, every exhaust is going to be specific to the application, but I'll just give you a quick tour of how mine works. Right here, passenger side comes off the manifold. You can see it goes into this catalytic converter. I've got the downstream O2 right in here. I've already test fit it and it fits. Upstream O2 is probably going to have to go on the outside of the exhaust, facing out into the frame rail. Then the exhaust comes down, goes across in front of that transmission cross member, where it jumps up into a V-band clamp up here, and that V-band clamp does clear that downstream O2 on the driver's side. The driver's side exhaust had to kick over pretty aggressively right away to get out of the way of that front drive shaft. It goes above the cross member as well, and then comes down here where it hits a 45, dives into the exhaust, turns it basically into a 2-into-1 before it goes into my pipes, chambered muffler, and catback exhaust that was originally on this Jeep, believe it or not, with the V6. So now I'm at the point where I'm ready to completely remove the exhaust and TIG weld it on the bench. I've put enough tacks in place where it's not going to move or twist or bend when I take it out, but I will be TIG welding it, and for that, obviously, could normally be using a completely different welder, but I don't have to because I have my ESAB Rebel multi-process machine. So it's a simple flip of a switch and a couple leads, and this thing turns from a MIG welder to a TIG welder, just like that. We're rounding the corner, getting really close to having this thing done. We're basically just buttoning up a few things. So the first thing we're going to button up right now is the cooling system. So we have our 2 heater hoses. So these are the factory JK heater hoses. They need to get down to the inlet and outlet on the LS water pump. We have AC lines to deal with on the AC compressor down there. We have upper and lower radiator hoses, as well as transmission cooler lines. And then the last thing would be an air intake right here. And that should be it. Then it's filled with fluids and fire it. So it's actually pretty simple. All I'm gonna do is I'm gonna reuse the majority of these factory heater hoses. There's already a little 90 on here and a little 45 right there. What I'm gonna do is basically cut them back here. I'm gonna put a union in it and just extend these down with some bulk hose. The lower hose, I believe I can reuse a JK hose. The JK lower, I just gotta trim it to fit. And then the upper hose is gonna be a little bit trickier. I actually have the hose for the Silverado, and it's gonna have to go all the way around to the opposite side because the inlet on the JK is over there. And that should take care of all of the plumbing for the cooling. So we'll do that, and then we'll throw a radiator and a fan in it. So with the radiator back in, the cooling system is essentially done now. We basically have our transmission cooler lines hooked up underneath heater hoses and upper and lower radiator hoses. The lower radiator hose is a factory JK hose, just chopped it to fit. It's super short, basically just goes in between the LS water pump and the JK radiator. The upper hose is actually from the Silverado. I just ordered a new one, and then I just trimmed it to fit with a small little union. I like this hose because on the Silverado, the hose actually goes all the way over to the other side of the engine. So basically it's a good hose to buy if you have to do a big move like this and get it to the other side of the engine. It has a coupler now in the middle, and I'm using one of these thermoplastic couplers. I've never used these before. This is the first time I'm trying it, and if it works, I'll probably go ahead and swap out these worm gear clamps on the 5/8 heater hose because I don't like these. I think these look ugly, and this looks a lot better. And honestly, this should never have to come apart. So these are supposed to just get tighter the hotter they get, so hopefully they'll work out. One upgrade I did choose to do as part of the RPM Extreme kit is what's called the Pentastar fan upgrade. So that is the fan and shroud out of the newer 12 and up JK, and to make it work, you buy their harness. You basically end up with this harness right here, and it has a small trigger wire, and then there's a trigger wire that's worked into the harness that comes with your kit with your LS. And so what this does is this fan is what's called a pulse width modulated fan. So that means it can operate at multiple speeds. So at just basically low engine temps, it's going to start running just the nice slow speed. Maybe when you energize your AC, it's going to run at a little bit faster speed, and then if the engine gets hot, it's going to start moving a lot of air. It's supposed to be a lot more efficient than the fan out of the 07 to 11 JK. So hopefully that upgrade is well worth it. The fan I just picked up on eBay, super cheap. It wasn't a lot of money. And at this point, we are essentially finished the entire LS swap in your JK. Next step is to deal with fluids in everything that you touch. So for me, that means all new brake fluid, power steering fluid, engine oil, transmission fluid, transfer case fluid, and fuel, everything, cycle the key a couple times, make sure everything looks good, and then we'll be able to fire this thing off and see how this new LS sounds inside this two-door Gladiator and take it for a test drive. All the fluids are topped up now. We're pretty much ready to almost fire this thing up. I just have my battery charger charging up the battery before I do that because this thing's been sitting for so long. One thing I do want to take care of before I do that though are my AC lines. Now the AC lines, the only way to do this is a set of custom lines. So we kind of have a little hodgepodge going on here, but this is what we've got. So the line that comes off of the firewall, the small line that goes up to the condenser, you can reuse that line. You will need to change and get a custom line that goes from the condenser down to the compressor, and then from the firewall down to the compressor as well. So what I did is I took my lines down to my local AC shop, and what I have is, this is the line that comes off of the firewall and goes down to the compressor. So this is one line. And then this other line is the line that goes from the compressor and goes up to the condenser on the Jeep. Now, one thing you do want to make sure is that the lines are clocked correctly. Now, what I mean by that is when they crimp this hose together, there's this, basically this attachment point right here. This, I believe, goes into the compressor. And so what you want to do is this can twist and turn. You don't want this line to have to be under tension or basically turned a whole bunch. So what I have them do is I have them just crimp one end of the line, and then on the other end of the line, I have them leave it uncrimped on the two lines. Then what I will do is bolt it all up. I'll take a paint pen and I will mark the fitting, I'll mark the cover, and I'll mark the line, and then I'll take it back to them, and then they will crimp these for good. That way I will know that they are in the right spot. So I'm gonna test fit all of these right now, and then mark them, and then we can take them down and get them crimped. Since we're going to be using the JK computer to turn the air conditioning on and off, we do need to use a pressure switch out of the JK, not out of the LS AC line. So we simply remove the one that was on the line from your donor motor and just screw on either your old sensor, or in this case, I just went and bought a brand new AC pressure sensor. Once it's on, then we can go ahead and charge up the AC once the vehicle's running. All right, this is it. It's time for the first test drive of our LS swapped two-door Gladiator. A couple things I do before I take it out. I put it on the lift, let the transmission cycle through all the gears, recheck the fluid. That way the fluid has filled all the passages, ended up having to add 2 quarts after that. Check the rest of the fluid, let it idle for a while, made sure it didn't overheat, made sure the electric fan came on, charged up the AC, made sure everything was good there. And I think we're in good shape. One other thing that I do like to do when I go out on a test drive like this is I have my HP Tuners software running on my laptop in the passenger seat, and it is hooked up with the basically Bluetooth dongle into the OBD2 port, because this vehicle is using an OEM computer, so I can monitor all the engine vitals. Because yes, it is making the gauges work on the JK dash, but it's nicer to have actual numbers and data coming right out of the computer. So that's what I'm gonna do. So right now, I'm gonna fire it up, open the door, we're gonna drive it out. Let's see what this thing can do. I need more power steering fluid. Turn the toe. It's like a crazy muggy hot day. AC's blowing ice cold. Absolutely love it. Oh man, it rides so good. Oh, it's so good. Cruise control works. Oh my god, I love it. LS Swap JK with functioning cruise control. Truck's working great on the test drive. Only thing right now I think I can find is, I think I may be down on power steering fluid. It's got like a little whine to it. So I'm gonna take it back to the shop, check all the fluids. But aside from that, driving it, man, it's awesome. It's got enough power, it's easy to drive, feels great on the highway, feels great in town, shifts really good. Everything about this truck so far with this V8 in it is absolutely perfect. The RPM Extreme kit, I can't say enough about it. It works great. Everything is functioning on my dash. Everything is functioning with the truck. I can turn the AC on and off. The key works. The cruise works. Everything that you would want to have work is working. This Jeep is acting like it came from the factory with an LS and a 4L80 in it. And that is the whole point of this swap. Super happy with it. So now you've finished your V8 swap, your job is not done yet. You still have a little bit of work even though you're now driving your Jeep around. So you want to spend the first few trips spending a lot of time after you drive it performing visual inspections. You have to remember, you have now installed an engine into an engine bay that it was not designed for. So things like the routing of wiring harnesses and coolant tubes and fuel lines and stuff like that, you now have placed them into new spots. You may think that that's the best place for it, but it might not be. So you want to perform visual inspections. Make sure you're not melting any wiring loom. Make sure your fuel lines aren't contacting anything that's either going to rotate or get too hot. Make sure there don't have any leaks. Just keep an eye on everything. Honestly, the first few times you drive the vehicle, you might want to just make sure that the radio is completely off. And if you have HP tuners, you might want to also log those first few trips just so you can ensure that everything is functioning correctly. And then after that, it's just down to enjoying the truck. Is a V8 swap worth it in a Jeep? Absolutely. The Jeeps do great with V8s under the hood. Now here's the question that I know all of you want to know. How much does it cost to get an LS engine underneath the hood of your JK? Well, I didn't keep track of every single thing because there's just a lot of stuff that went in there. And I also made some decisions that you guys probably wouldn't. I have a brand new transmission and I bought that rebuilt long block. You could get away with just a good known engine transmission combo out of a junkyard and save yourself a bunch of cash. I am right around $10,000 to $12,000 to get this V8 underneath the hood of the JK and get it running and functioning as it was meant to be from the factory. And honestly, I love it. I don't think I've ever done a V8 swap on a vehicle and thought it was a bad decision. I think the Jeep JK was meant to have a V8 underneath the hood. So if you're LS swapping your JK, I hope you do it. I hope this video made it a little bit easier for you, and I hope you enjoy it when you get it done.